Welcome to the Daily Report. It's Tuesday, March 8th here in Korea. The number of severe COVID-19 cases and that of fatalities are rising given the mounting caseloads Korea has been witnessing amid the onset of Omicron. We start now with the tallies. I have Kwon So standing by. So do start us off.
Sunny, Korea's Tuesday caseload remains at above 200,000. Let's take a look at the exact figure. 202,721 cases were tallied as of 12 a.m. It marks a slight decrease in both domestic transmissions and imported cases from the day before. And also, if we take a look at our graph, we can see that the numbers have been going down slightly. But if we compare the figure to last Tuesday, it is an on-week rise by close to 64,000 cases. And moving over to our map, around 50% of cases were concentrated in the capital region, with a little over 100,000 combined in Gyeonggi-do Province, Seoul and Incheon, which means a little under 50% in the rest of the nation. And unfortunately, another triple-digit figure of fatalities in the past day, with 186 people having lost their lives in the past day. And also, the number of patients that are currently in severe or critical condition has been steadily going up, as you can see, and now has surpassed the 1,000 mark. Now, moving over to vaccination figures, the percentage of people who got their first COVID-19 dose has gone up slightly, now to 87.5%. We've got 86.5% who got their additional, or their second shot, I should say, and 62.1% who got their additional shot or booster shot, now at 31.8 million. Moving over to the global figures, around 1.5 million new COVID-19 cases were posted in the past day as of noon Korea time, with a little over 7,800 COVID-19 related deaths. And there are still some countries reporting over 100,000 cases on a daily basis. That's countries like Germany and also the UK over there. And Russia has hit the 17 million mark in its accumulated caseload in the past day. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for the global tallies over the past 24 hours. As mentioned earlier, concerns are mounting over the persistent rise in the number of severe infections as well as fatalities here on the local front. For more, I have Choi Min-jung in the studio. Min-jung, good to see you again.
Thank you for having me, Sunny.
Right, so the sheer scale of our current outbreak appears to be driving up ICU tallies and related losses of lives, right?
That's right, Sunny. With cases continuing to surge, authorities are bracing for a further uptick in the number of severely ill patients as well as deaths. As Swa mentioned earlier, with more than 50 added on Tuesday, we saw over 1,000 critically ill patients, and authorities say this figure could potentially rise to more than 2,700. We've also been seeing triple-digit death tolls on a daily basis, higher than what we witnessed at the end of last year when Delta was the dominant strain. Authorities are expecting even more fatalities 2 to 4 weeks after the Omicron wave hits its peak. And on that note, health authorities continue to stress that Omicron doesn't pose a serious health threat to people who've gotten their booster shots. Recent data show that the fatality rate of Omicron hovered at 0.07% for people who've received an extra dose. And this is similar to that of the seasonal flu, which is known to be fatal in around 0.05% to 0.1% of all cases. Authorities pointed out that the death rate for unvaccinated people, however, is at 0.6%, which is 6 times that of the seasonal flu. Also, not a single Omicron death has been reported among people under 60 who got their boosters. Meanwhile, for people who are 60 and over, the death at this alert level has been issued. The KDCA chief explained that the upgrade is due to the fact that more ICU beds are now filled at above 50% of total capacity, and with the number of deaths expected to rise with more people over 60 getting infected. This also comes as recent data has shown that Omicron strain accounted for nearly 100% of our new cases. Of these, the subvariant of Omicron, also known as stealth Omicron, accounted for 23% of domestic cases, and the figure doubled within just a couple of days. Studies so far have shown that the stealth variant is 30% more transmissible than Omicron, with no meaningful differences in health outcomes and the effectiveness of vaccine protection.
And Min-jung, concerns are also being raised over infections among school children. Tell us about that as well.
Right, the virus is currently spreading rapidly among teenagers as well as young children, especially in the capital region. Over the past week, over 27,000 students were infected in Gyeonggi-do Province, and more than 25,000 cases were reported in Seoul. The new school semester began with more than 84% of schools in the capital holding in-person classes, but this figure dropped to 66% on Monday. With the virus spreading quickly among the faculty as well, education authorities are allowing teachers to lead classes from home to address any learning gaps. In principle, teachers who are infected must go on leave, but now they will be able to teach students remotely if their symptoms are mild.
All right, Minjung, thank you for now, but do stay with us for more talks.
Sure.
Right, up next, we have the latest from Tuesday's morning briefing on the local COVID-19 situation. Soa, and I understand the government has spoken about the current medical capacity.
Yes, Sunny, and stable is the word the government officials continue to be using to describe the current situation in managing severely or critically ill patients. And although the number of people in such a condition has surpassed 1,000 for the first time in more than 2 months, so around the level when the country was dealing with a Delta wave, officials said at Tuesday's government briefing that the number of serious or critical cases is actually going up slower than expected. And thus, this is what official Park Kyang had to say.
We want to emphasize once more that our current medical capacity can sufficiently handle around 2,000 patients in serious or critical condition. We also want to add that it's possible to raise that figure to 2,500 patients if we can make more efficient use of our existing hospital beds.
But if you remember, Min Jung saying that we might even go up to around 2,700. And at the scene, health workers are reportedly feeling the burden of the rising cases. However, another official, Son Young-nae, said the government is continuing to consult with frontline medical workers, and there have not been signs yet of saturation. As of this Tuesday, around 40% of ICU beds are available. That's 1,113 beds nationwide. And those are all immediately ready for use, Son stressed. Regarding the difference in the occupancy rate by region, he said this.
Depending on where we're looking at, some parts of the country could see an ICU occupancy rate of over 80% at some point. We could tie these districts together into a wider region to allow for a more even distribution of patients. And we're also looking at more efficient ways of managing beds for moderately ill patients.
He also added that in countries where the accumulated death toll stands at 100,000 or 200,000, that's countries where which have failed in managing those people in severe or critical condition. And that is why the occupancy rate of the ICU beds here in Korea, that this figure does matter in assessing the situation when it comes to patients in such a condition.
Right, and with just 1 day left to the presidential election, so I hear authorities are reiterating the importance of COVID-19 prevention at polling stations.
Right, we will also later have our Jessica Lee with a report on site regarding this, but also this issue has been addressed at the government briefing earlier, and it is an unprecedented presidential election where COVID-19 patients will be allowed to vote in person, and some changes have been announced ahead of the big day. Now, different from Saturday, with the second day of the early voting period when infected and quarantined people could cast their ballots. On the actual voting day on Wednesday, they will be able to put their votes into the ballot boxes themselves, a decision made by the National Election Commission following voter complaints over some glitches on Saturday. So this announcement has already been made on Monday. The time frame for voting will be between 6 and 7:30 p.m. But another last-minute change that's been made is that COVID-19 patients and those in isolation may leave their home or treatment venue starting 5:50 p.m., not 5:30. So there were a number of twists made on Monday afternoon. And also today, government officials said that people subject to this special voting are to receive a text message for further information. And health authorities are asking these voters to wear face masks, KF94 face masks, and either walk, use their own vehicles, or take special taxis to get to their designated polling station. The actual voting will take place once all regular voters have left. Officials warned that infected voters must abide by the given time frame and not stop by places other than the polling station.
This can be regarded as a violation of self-isolation rules, and punitive guidelines will apply if this is found to be the case. This particular offense is punishable by up to 1 year in prison or a maximum fine of 10 million Korean won.
Right. And so do we know how many people will be exercising this special voting right amid this pandemic?
Well, a rough number, I should say, because officials mentioned that there were also people who already took to their votings on the weekend for the early voting period. But for now, there are currently 1.16 million people roughly that are being treated at home, so for at-home treatment. If we subtract the number of people that are not eligible to vote because they are too young, we've got around 880,000 voters. But that's just a rough number, with an official saying that it's hard to predict the exact number of those people who will actually go to vote tomorrow.
Right, of course. Right, so let's now expand our talk to include Min Jung. Now, Min Jung, more information regarding COVID-19 vaccination for children here in the country will be shared soon, I hear.
That's right. Health authorities are planning to announce detailed plans on inoculating children aged 5 to 11 next Monday. Last month, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety gave the green light to Pfizer's vaccine for kids in this age bracket, and authorities have continued to stress that it's important to vaccinate those at high risk or those with weakened immune systems, as studies show that the vaccine is effective in preventing severe illness. And as I mentioned earlier, infections are spreading fast among young children, 11 and under, so this is a significant development. And given the current situation, authorities say they will make great efforts to vaccinate as many young children as soon as possible.
Right, that is good to know. Meanwhile, over in the US, so I understand one particular state is looking to adjust its COVID-19 vaccination recommendation for children. Tell us about that.
Right. While the US CDC has been authorizing vaccinations for kids aged 5 and above back in November, Florida now decided to not recommend these vaccinations for healthy children. According to the Florida Department of Health on Monday local time, the state is set to issue a separate guidance calling on parents not to get their healthy kids vaccinated. When this will come into effect and details on why were not yet available, but discussions involved experts who were concerned about the safety of vaccines in children. This would be the first time a U.S. state has broken away from the CDC guidelines. So far, around 22 million children have been vaccinated against COVID-19 in the U.S., with 1.1 million of them from Florida. Since the beginning of January, however, almost 4.5 million children were infected, and with hospitalizations among unvaccinated much higher. Now, this latest decision may or not trigger other states to follow suit, and also maybe influence other countries in making their decisions regarding vaccination for the younger population. As Min Jung earlier mentioned, Korea for now will recommend this for those at high risk. So that would actually be maybe in line with what Florida is doing for now, if it is categorizing who should get vaccinated or not.
Right. All right. So as always, thank you very much for that. And Min Jung, thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Topping our headlines at this hour, the international community has renewed its call for safe passage of civilians out of Ukraine and for essential aid into Ukraine. Our Song Yoo-jin has more on this humanitarian request and other related events.
Entering the 13th day since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United Nations Security Council held a briefing on Ukraine's humanitarian situation Monday local time. The U.S. and its allies urged Russia to allow the safe evacuation of civilians and aid to battlegrounds after Moscow was accused of offering evacuation routes, which led to Russia and its key ally, Belarus.
We call for the Russian Federation to agree to and honor in good faith Ukrainian proposals for time-bound humanitarian safe passage in specific agreed-upon locations.
Russia is advocating humanitarian corridors towards Russia. I don't know of too many Ukrainians who wish to seek refuge in Russia. This is hypocrisy.
The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed that at least 406 civilians, including 27 children, have lost their lives since Russia began attacks. However, the real figure is likely to be higher as intense fighting has resulted in delays transferring information. The agency added that more than 1.7 million people have left Ukraine following Moscow's attack. Meanwhile, in an effort to support U.S. forces in Europe in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. Department of Defense has ordered the deployment of additional troops and military assets to different parts of Europe. The Pentagon announced on Monday local time that a total of 500 troops and KC-135 refueling aircraft will be dispatched, although the exact number of aircrafts was not specified. This will bring the total number of U.S. military personnel currently stationed in Europe to around 100,000. The U.S. also held an emergency video call with Germany, the U.K., and France on Monday, reaffirming their joint stance that Russia should pay the price for its unprovoked onslaught. The four state leaders also promised to continue security, economic, and humanitarian support for Kyiv. Over in Ukraine, a third round of talks with Russia ended with no major breakthroughs. Progress was only made in an agreement to evacuate civilians in Ukraine through humanitarian corridors on Tuesday. Both sides promised to meet for a fourth time in Belarus in the near future, while the foreign ministers of the two countries are slated to meet in Turkey on Thursday, marking their first talks since the invasion began. 송유진, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, those opposed to Kremlin's war in Ukraine have been gathering in front of the Russian embassy in capital Seoul to share their outrage. Our Ishihu has their story.
Blue and yellow flags in the air and signs denouncing Russia. On Sunday, the 11th day since Russia invaded Ukraine, some 280 people gathered in front of the Russian embassy in Seoul to protest the war. It was a multinational crowd which included Ukrainians, Koreans, and people from around the world coming out for the second Sunday rally since the crisis began.
We want Russia to hear that we want this war to stop, and we want peace for Ukraine. So we want to be heard louder, we want to be heard more, because Ukraine is fighting now and it's a really hard fight and we need a lot of help now.
And they asked for Korea's support.
We ask the Korean government to continue to support sanctions against Russia and to provide support to Ukraine, military support, funding. We need people to be aware of this, and we need people to not be silent.
The rally began with speeches describing the dire situation in Ukraine. One Ukrainian who lives in Seoul read out a letter from a friend back home.
제 사이렌 소리가 멈추지 않고 있고 우리는 계속 지하실에서 몸을 숨기고 있습니다.
There was also a moment of silence for the victims. Then began a long march around the Russian embassy to the sound of traditional Ukrainian music.
Some people here say they came out today because they've had friends and families back home who had to flee their homes because of the crisis.
Because my family right now is in Kiev and they're hearing bombs, they're scared, and I stand here for my family in Kiev and for all Ukrainians.
Koreans at the rally shared those sentiments.
As a citizen of a country that has also experienced war, I can understand the pain of having one's territory invaded.
He added that while Koreans have been actively participating in campaigns on social media, more could be done to raise awareness of the suffering of people in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian embassy in Seoul has been accepting donations of money and supplies for the relief effort, as have Korean NGOs. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
Over in the U.S., shares plunged on Wall Street in response to surging global oil prices amid Russia's military campaign in Ukraine. Peunji reports.
Global shares tumbled as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to expectations of a spike in prices of energy and raw materials. The Dow Jones Industrial Average slid more than 2% on Monday, falling almost 800 points. It ended down more than 10% from its closing record high on January 4th, confirming it was in a correction. A correction is confirmed when an index closes 10% or more below its record closing level. The index last entered a correction in February 2020. The Nasdaq on Monday sank 3.6%. It ended down 20% from its record high close on November 19th, meaning that the tech-heavy index has also fallen into a so-called bear market. This marks the Nasdaq's first bear market since March 2020, when the pandemic crushed global economies. The S&P 500 fell almost 3%, marking its biggest single-day decline since October 2020. The sharp stock market fall came as oil prices spiked, with WTI crude hitting a 13-year high of $130 a barrel overnight on early Monday. The spike followed U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying on Sunday that Washington and its allies are eyeing a ban on Russian oil and natural gas imports for its actions against Ukraine. The U.S. gets around 8% of its oil imports from Russia, but there are increasing calls to cut off Moscow from the money it gets from oil and natural gas exports. 배은지, Arirang News.
In other news, member nations of the UN Security Council have failed to adopt a statement denouncing North Korea's repeated violations of resolutions regarding its missile technology. Our Kim Yo-sun tells us why.
The UN Security Council has failed to reach a substantive outcome in its latest meeting to address North Korea's ballistic missile activities. The U.S. and its European allies on the Council failed to convince China and Russia to back an official statement condemning the North's violations of existing resolutions. Following Monday's closed-door meeting, the U.S. ambassador to the UN urged members of the Council to speak with one voice.
But let us start with the basic premise that the Council has a responsibility to speak publicly about clear and repeated violations of Security Council resolutions. We call on all Council members to speak with one voice in condemning these dangerous and unlawful acts.
The statement was backed by 10 other ambassadors, including countries not on the Security Council, such as Australia and Japan. Cho Hyun, Seoul's ambassador to the UN, also endorsed a statement saying the Council must publicly address the North's launches, which are clear and repeated violations of UNSC resolutions. The diplomats also reaffirmed their commitment to engage diplomatically with the North. The meeting came some 48 hours after the North conducted its 9th weapons test of the year. Meanwhile, the U.S. nuclear watchdog has spotted signs of activity at North Korea's main Yongbyon nuclear complex, as well as at other facilities. The IAEA also detected ongoing indications of activity at the Gangsan uranium enrichment complex and at the Pyeongsan uranium mine and concentration plant. The head of the agency said the continuation of North Korea's nuclear program is deeply regrettable, stressing it's a clear violation of UN resolutions. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. The French army said Monday that its anti-jihadist force in Mali had killed Yahya Jouadi, a known senior leader of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, responsible for finance and logistics. Jouadi is an Algerian, also known as Abu Ammar al-Jazari, and he was killed overnight from February 25th to 26th, roughly 160 kilometers north of Timbuktu in central Mali. In its statement, the French army also noted that he was killed by ground forces, supported by a Tiger attack helicopter and 2 drones. Jouadi was known as a major link in northern Mali to the Al-Qaeda, and has been known to organize the terrorist group while coordinating supplies, financing, and logistics. Nearly 400 civilians have been killed in attacks in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over the country last year. According to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, on Monday, of the 397 civilians killed in the country, more than 80% were at the hands of the Islamic State, as she underscored the scale of insurgency faced by the new government. While ISIS-K first appeared in eastern Afghanistan in late 2014, the group is thought to have spread further in the wake of the Taliban takeover and have been blamed for several suicide attacks in recent months, including one at Kabul airport last August. The latest report is the first major human rights report since the Taliban seized power and covers the period from August 2021 to the end of February 2022. Over in Egypt, a landmark moment in the country's judicial history on Sunday, as 98 women took seats on the State Council. The appointment follows a presidential decree in October 2021, which resulted in a number of women taking an oath before the head of the State Council, ahead of being assigned to various circuit courts. While women have been practicing law in Egypt since the 1930s, none held any judicial positions until 2003, when the first female judge, Tahani El-Gabali, was appointed to the Constitutional Court. In 2021, the World Economic Forum ranked Egypt 129th on the global gender gap list, with the country having significantly closed its total gender gap and made progress in political empowerment, health and survival, as well as educational attainment. Mexico's top division football league suspended matches Sunday and may ban fans from attending away matches after a massive brawl among supporters last Saturday, which resulted in 17 deaths and injuries to 26 others. The deadly unrest took place during a match between hosts Querétaro and Atlas, as the match was suspended in the 62nd minute after multiple fights broke out in the stands. State authorities in north-central Mexico have also suspended 5 officials, including police and civil defense employees, over the brawl. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Korea's 20th presidential election is slated for tomorrow. That would be March 9th, and it is the first to take place amid a pandemic. Accordingly, preparations at polling stations include a host of health precautions as well. To take a look.
South Korea's 20th presidential election will be held on March 9th. It is the first of its kind taking place amid a pandemic. Therefore, the process of preparing for the election was different than before. For instance, candidate speeches were held without an audience, and COVID-19 prevention measures were a major topic of presidential debates.
Just as the election campaign has changed due to COVID-19, the scenery of South Korea's presidential election polling stations will look different than before. So let's take a look at what's changing.
This presidential election is the first one in which 18-year-olds have the right to vote. In the previous presidential election, only citizens aged 19 and above could vote. Not only that, COVID-19 patients and people in self-quarantine would also be able to vote in person.
지난 2월 16일 코로나19 확진 격리자들의 참정권 보장을 위해 공직선거법이 개정되었습니다. 3월 9일 선거일 오후 6시부터 오후 7시 30분까지 관할 투표소를 방문하시면 코로나 확진 격리 유권자분들도 투표하실 수 있습니다.
On election day, general voters can visit designated polling stations between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. as before. Voting is also possible for those who tested positive for COVID-19 and are self-isolation, but from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And they will be allowed to leave their homes or facilities to get to the polling stations and must also immediately return home after casting their ballots and cannot stop by other places. If you get infected or are under self-quarantine, you should not use public transportation to get to polling stations. You have to wear a mask all the time and minimize contact with others by walking to the polling stations or using private vehicles or quarantine taxis. When you arrive at the polling station, you must present a text message that confirms you are a COVID-19 patient. After that, you're able to cast your ballot.
선거관리위원회는 투표소 소독, 환기 등 방역에 최선을 다하고 있습니다. 담당 사무원 및 참관인은 전신보호복, 안면보호구 등 개인 보호구를 착용합니다.
Based on the experience of the 2020 general election, which was the first major election to take place amid the pandemic, as well as the by-election in April last year, The National Election Commission plans to focus on creating safe and clean environment for voters. In fact, both of the earlier elections concluded without a single infection at the polling stations.
In the 21st general election in 2020 and the by-election last year, confirmed patients could only vote by mail or vote during the early voting period. However, this is the first time that people who tested positive can exercise their right to vote in person and on the same day as non-infected voters. As COVID-19 patients make their way to the polling station on their own, it is almost impossible to control each and every case. In addition to this, the possibility of infected voters crossing paths with non-infected voters cannot be ruled out.
1차적으로 제일 중요한 거는 그 확진자들이나 격리자들과 그 일반 투표자들이 이 동선 과정에서 최소한 1m 이상 이내에 붙는 그런 그 과정들은 없어야 된다고 생각하거든요. 또한 이제 접촉 감염은 이제 공용으로 만지는 그런 상황들, 그냥 공용 물품이나 그런 시설들을 만지는 상황에서 생기는데 가장 유의해야 될 부분들은 사실 화장실이라고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 가능하다 그러면 확진자와 이제 그런 확진자와 일반 투표자들은 그 최대한도로 동선을 떨어뜨리고.
The number of daily confirmed cases increased faster than health authorities earlier expected, and the number of self-quarantined patients exceeded 1 million this past weekend. That's more than 2% of almost 44.2 million eligible voters. Meanwhile, the National Election Commission apologized for controversy over the management of temporary polling booths for COVID-19 patients in the early voting period last weekend. Therefore, on the actual election day, people who tested positive and are in self-quarantine will vote in the same way as non-infected voters at the same voting booths, once all general voters have left the election venue.
The upcoming presidential election will be held under the challenging circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. So please make sure to follow strict COVID-19 prevention measures when visiting polling stations to cast your ballot. This has been Jessica Lee.
Geopolitical concerns are weighing heavily on economic matters in many parts of the world amid Russia's violent military campaign in Ukraine. For more, I have Professor Kim Se-won from Ewha Women's University. Professor Kim, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Professor Oh Jun-seok from Sookmyung Women's University. It's good to see you again, Professor Oh.
My pleasure.
Meanwhile, joining the session virtually is Mr. Troy Stangaron, Senior Director at the Korean Economic Institute of America. It's a pleasure to have you on, Mr. Stangaron.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Professor Kim, we'll start here in the studio. Korea's exports have expanded for 16 consecutive months back in February as well and pushed the trade balance in goods back into positive territory. Let's begin with a few words on these favorable findings.
Yes, the export has been the main driving force to recover Korean economy since the outbreak of pandemic 2 years ago. Despite the spike in imports due to higher oil prices, Korean economy was still able to post a trade surplus in February of $840 million, which is a turnover of the previous 2 months' trade deficits. Korea's export stood at $53.9 billion, or a 21% increase in February from a year earlier, as overseas shipments of the memory chips, automobiles, and chemical products increased over global economic recovery. It is actually one of the largest imports size in the history of the Korea from 1950s. We also have a highest figure for imports in February, which amounts to $53.1 billion, which is 25% increase on yearly basis. So Korean economy is, relatively speaking, and Korean export is also recovering from previous 2 months' trade deficits. However, there are quite a few uncertainties ahead of Korean export for this year because there are lots of negative factors like geopolitical issues in Ukraine and still disrupted global production chain and particularly slowing Chinese economy. So I think Korean trade surplus will be switching between negative and positive quite a few times until the end of this year.
Right. And keeping in mind what Professor Kim has just said, Professor, despite the stellar performance, of course, on the export front, prospects look quite obscure given the uncertainties in light of the situation over in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
As Professor Kim commented about the geopolitical alignment, I might say the war has triggered the geopolitical realignment, which means the ups and downs of the economy is expected. What is worried on the economic side now is two things. One is inflation due to supply chain disruption, and second one is the financial instability caused by the market disruption because of the interconnectedness of the global economy with the financial market. More than anything else, I must mention the war in Ukraine comes at a bad time for the economy because already I might say the inflation has been on the way due to COVID-19 pandemic, and then overmore there is a spark of the oil price already up to $110 per barrel, and then supply chain disruption over energy, which might aggravate the inflation. Someone say that the agflation means the overall price of agricultural product to the slow inflation, cost increase of the raw material and then energy, and then even to the stagflation. And another thing we have to think about this is the market disruption. Already FedEx and UPS has halted its shipment to and from Russia, and then Maersk as a giant ocean cargo carrier stopped accepting order bound for the Russian goods. And then investors famously detest this kind of business uncertainty. As a result, the Korean stock market and then Dow Jones plummeted down 700 points right after the invasion. As such that we might say the financial instability might cause a lot of negative effect on the global economy. And it is expected the financial market instability will dent confidence among customers and then business altogether for the time being.
Right. And Mr. Stangaran over in the US, what more can you tell us about the broader repercussions of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, especially on the global oil market?
So when we think about this from both the US and the global perspective, Russia is one of the world's largest energy producers. Prior to the invasion, it accounted for about 12% of crude oil exports, about 10% of refined petroleum, but also more significantly, 25% of LNG exports in the world. And as been mentioned, we've seen oil prices go up since the invasion. They're touching about $130 a barrel. Prior to the invasion, you had a situation to where there was already a very small difference between the supply that was available and the demand. So you had tight energy markets. The U.S. knew that the war was coming. We've seen the U.S. intelligence agencies talk about this consistently in the lead up to the war. The United States has been working with partners specifically in the Middle East to try and take and alleviate some of these challenges. You know specifically 85% of Russian LNG exports go to Europe. The United States knew there was a chance that Russia could try to cut off those exports to Europe or use that as a threat. So they've worked to try and improve LNG specifically to Germany via tankers. And so there's been a lot of work done by the United States to try and find other avenues. We've also seen recently, the United States has been talking with Iran for a while to try and resolve the nuclear deal. There's been reports over the last week or two that they might be close to resuming that. If you get a deal with Iran, that would take it to help alleviate some of the potential losses from Russia on global markets. But more interestingly, the United States is also apparently reaching out to Venezuela to see if they can try and pull Venezuela away from Russia, perhaps relieve some sanctions there, and also try and take and put more oil onto the markets to deal with these challenges. So it's a concern, but the U.S. government and our partners are trying to work to find a way to try and alleviate some of these strains on the energy market.
Right, they are. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, there was quite a bit of local media coverage about Korea securing an exemption from the US's foreign direct product rule, which comes as part of tougher trade restrictions on Russia. Do tell us more about this particular rule and the implications of an exemption for Korean companies.
First of all, the size of the Korean export to Russia is not negligible. It is about $10 billion as of last year. And the major export items from Korea to Russia are automobile, auto parts, and steel, complicated high-tech steel products. After invasion of Russia into Ukraine last month, all U.S. allies and EU member countries joined a package of economic sanctions to Russia right away. But it is true that Korea government gave an impression that Korean government is kind of hesitating in joining this sanction in the early stage of the invasion. Anyway, Korea was not included in the first foreign direct product rule exemption list of the U.S. government. But last Friday, over a negotiation with U.S. government, Korean government finally won exemption from a foreign direct product role of U.S. government, which is a good news to Korean exporters to Russia. So actually, quite a few Korean companies are using U.S. technologies and software for their export items to Russia. So Korean companies are feared to affect from this foreign direct product rule. And finally, it is a good news to have won the exemption from U.S. government.
Right. So the software that we're using are used in our making of mobile phones, cars, and washing machines, is that
right,
it?
Right, exactly.
Right. Mr. Stangaran, what does this exemption imply with regard to the Seoul-Washington alliance, do you think?
Well, I think, as Dr. Kim just said, Trade Minister Yo was in D.C. He was working with the United States. There's been a lot of efforts over the last few months on other issues as well, to where the United States and South Korea have been working closely. So I think this really signals three things, even if it took longer for Korea to get to this point. One is that there's a deep working relationship between the United States and South Korea. It's something we knew, but we've seen that more recently in this situation. It also signifies that the United States and South Korea trust each other. When we look at how this is going to work, part of this is ensuring that goods are not sent to Russian entities that perhaps have ties to the military. So this signals that the United States trusts South Korea to make sure that what is exported to Russia goes to the right individuals, which is the population in Russia, not the government and the military. And lastly, and I think perhaps most importantly, it signals that the United States and what its allies are trying to do, which is deny the Russian government, which is responsible for what's going on, access to the tools it needs to wage war, and not the Russian population who needs access to consumer goods. And so I think those are the three main takeaways from this decision.
Right. And also under the punitive measures, Professor O, we have the SWIFT that has confirmed it will disconnect Russian banks subject to EU sanctions from the international payment system starting on March 12th, which would be this coming Saturday. What exactly does this financial restriction entail?
Since its initial creation in 1973, SWIFT has held strong as a kind of cushion for enabling the universal banking messaging system, making international transaction and settlement for any bank across the globe. SWIFT stands for Society for a Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Today, SWIFT connects more than 11,000 financial institutes in more than different 200 countries. What is the effect for Korean companies doing export and investment? Definitely negative outlook. As Professor Kim commented about, the trading volume with Russia is not negligible, but there is one thing we have to think about: the strategic alliance, economically strategic alliance with Russia is also important in the near future. Simply speaking, cutting a bank from the SWIFT system is similar to cutting a person off from the internet. exactly the same situation. Simply speaking, without SWIFT, nor internet shopping, nor internet banking is allowed in the international transaction, whether in the form of international trade or international investment. In prior to buyer's payment, seller have to procure product and then make a shipment in advance. Isn't it risky? So as a cushion for this kind of risk insulation, SWIFT system is required, so-called that the bank have to give honor. This honor is a banking terminology, which means settlement or the guaranteed payment by bank. With this honor of the bank, that it is feasible to make international trade. But here, one thing I must add comment is about it is the move to ban Russia from the SWIFT might likely hasten a new era of a monetary system. That is because as an alternative, Russia will likely to adopt a kind of blockchain system. So I might say that cryptocurrency might be used as an international settlement. At least between Russia and China, they might have fully developed, and then they might most probably interconnected as an alternative of their international settlement.
Right, in the absence of SWIFT then.
Right.
Mr. Stangaran, aside from supporting sanctions proposed by the US and its European allies against Russia, do you suppose Korea needs to take additional measures to perhaps share its condemnation of the bloodshed in Ukraine?
I do. When we look at this war, this is a different war than we've seen since the end of the Second World War. This is the first time one of the great powers has invaded its neighbor unprovoked. It's a situation to where, despite Russian rhetoric, this has nothing to do with NATO. This is ultimately about Russia's desire to have a sphere of influence and to dominate its near or broad neighbors. And this is the specific reason that the Eastern European countries joined NATO, to ensure that they would not again be dominated by the Russian state. And so what this ultimately boils down to is, what are the rules of the international system, and are we going to maintain a rules-based system in the international system? And for Korea, this has been a system that has been very beneficial to it. I think it's in Korea's national interest to ensure that it's maintained and to defend that order. And so from that very perspective alone, I think it's important for South Korea not just to take and join the United States and others in following those sanctions, but to also look and see what can it do to take and demonstrate to Russia that this is not acceptable in the 21st century, that we need to take and go back to the negotiating table and resolve things peacefully.
Right, and that may be a major task for the incoming administration, of course. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, back here on the local front, tariffs have been lowered to ease the burden on exporters, and fuel tax cuts have been extended to rein in inflation, which is a global concern, as you mentioned earlier. How do you respond to these efforts by the Moon administration, and what else do you propose to keep the local economy on track?
There's no question that one of the largest shocks from the war of Ukraine and Russia is the higher inflation generated from higher oil prices. So Korean government implements quite active measures to protect domestic households and companies, like slashing both of tariffs and taxes on oil products. I think they do have effects in the short run, but the problem is they can't do this forever because it is using government's money. We can't use government's money for these policy purposes forever. So given the current situation of inflation, the major factors are all out of the country, like international production chain disruptions and oil price increases. So there should be something more flexible tools or buffers that protects domestic households and companies against higher inflation, which is not easy for governments. So government should be more trying to think about the more tools to protect domestic citizens against the much higher than expected inflation.
Right. And Professor O, following Wednesday's presidential election, a new administration will come into office from May. What perhaps do you believe would be a major task for the incoming administration on the economic front?
As soon as when the new government take office in May, perfect system, always new government. There is a kind of inflation pressure, and then deferred interest rate hike will be proceeded as soon as possible. So tackle with the inflation pressure might be the top priority right after they take offices. And second is supply chain resilience is very important. Supply chain composed of various streams, but the upstream, I mean the part and raw material composed of small and medium companies, very fragile and very volatile to the economic shock. So new government have to provide kind of supporting fund to sustain their business after the take offices. And lastly, is resource and then energy diplomacy is needed as a kind of new trade policy of the new government. Especially, we have to make an economic partnership with the Middle East countries in a way to diversify source of energies.
Right, and talking about partners, Mr. Stangaran, Korea's top two trading partners are China and the US. That being said, what do you recommend for the incoming administration to seek to do, perhaps, to balance its ties with the US and China?
I think it's more in the long run about getting the balance right in the South Korean economy than it is about balancing between the United States and China. South Korea has traditionally been an export-oriented economy and specifically manufacturing-based. That has led to an underdevelopment of the services sector. You know, we talked earlier about how, for example, South Korean phones run on U.S. software. There are some, like Naver and Kakao companies that have promising potential software developments, but ultimately getting the balance between the service sector and manufacturing sector correct and reducing dependence on exports is going to be key. The less dependent South Korea is on exports, the less likely it is to see its economy disrupted by wars or other disruptions. And so heading forward, you know, it's also key for South Korea to do this because we're living in a time of economic change. Aside the war with Russia, setting aside the US-China trade war, we're seeing manufacturing and software integrated more, be it autonomous vehicles or other types of manufactured products. And so if South Korean industry wants to stay competitive either in the export markets or domestically, it really needs to take and improve the services sector, specifically in the area of software. So I think this is the real key in terms of balancing the economy going forward, not necessarily between the United States and China.
Right, and very briefly speaking, Professor Kim, what would you believe is the economic, or should be the economic priority for the incoming administration, keeping in mind what Mr. Stangaran has just said?
Well, it looks that everyone has different expectation and hopes on next government. I think the economy after COVID pandemic provides both of challenges and opportunities to Korean economy because industrial structure is changed and the way of people behave is changed. But let me just introduce the top 7 most urgent problems that should be taken care of by next government, which came from the survey of Korean Economic Association very recently. They are low productivity, low birth rate, unstable housing market, low potential economic growth, household debt, income polarization, and lastly, government debts.
That is a long list, Professor Kim. Right, there's a long list and a lot to do that. All right, Professor Kim, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts. Professor Oh, thank you for being with us today.
Thank
and
you.
Mr. Stangaran over in the US, thank you for your time and your thoughts as well.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back with more coverage tomorrow. That would be Wednesday, Election Day here in Korea. Join us then.